and shooting people. Now, $50 billion in money was paid out to U.S. corporations, promised to U.S. corporations. It's important that it hasn't all been paid out, to do this work. The corporations that have received the most money are the Bechtel Corporation. Yes, Bechtel deserves a hiss, whoever did that. The Bechtel Corporation, Shaw, Perini, the list goes on and on. There's 10 key U.S. contractors. Parsons, Halliburton received the largest money. They have been promised about $20 billion, which is, of course, an enormous sum. The rest of the sums look minuscule in comparison. Bechtel's is about $2.8 billion. Parsons is about 3.5. I'm not going to remember all these numbers. That money is, of course, an enormous quantity of money. The problem was that when these grants were given, first of all, Iraqis were, of course, overlooked. But not only were Iraqis overlooked, the entire structure of the economic reconstruction laid in place the results that we're seeing now. So one of the first acts of the U.S. occupation government, led by Paul Bremer, was called the De-Ba'athification Order. This was the order by which Bremer fired 120,000 of all of the key ministerial leaders in Iraq, all of the engineers, all of the scientists, all of the people who ran the water ministry, the electrical ministry, the oil ministry. He fired them all. 120,000 people. He fired them all because he didn't want anyone standing in the way of the restructuring that was being planned. That left an enormous brain vacuum. The next step that Bremer did was then to fire 500,000 Iraqi soldiers. Wait, yes, 500,000 Iraqi soldiers. The U.S. military had intended that those soldiers would be put to work to do the reconstruction. But the Bush administration's economic plan didn't include that. The Bush administration's economic plan was to bring in private contractors. So immediately from the get-go, you had 500,000 men with guns, made unemployed, without jobs, without money, and their families left without hope, without money. And some estimates put that number at 2.5 million Iraqis, 10% of the population, who from the get-go were now very, very hostile to the reconstruction and to the invasion, to the occupation. All of these people also knew that U.S. companies were being given billions of dollars to reconstruct the country. And you'll hear many people testify to the fact that there are many Iraqis who, while they were very upset that Iraqi companies, of which there were many, Iraqi workers, of which there were many, who were more than capable of doing the work, were being jumped over. But there was a sense that, well, if America is going to spend $10 billion fixing our electricity, that's not so bad, and, you know, maybe that'll be good. And there was a sense of allowing this to take place. The reconstruction failed, and one of the primary reasons why it failed was that the objective was not to just get the services up and running. The objective was this longer-term permanent presence, which I mentioned, so that you had companies like Bechtel spending the first 6 weeks in country, the first 6 weeks in country, walking around doing an assessment of the situation. They could have talked to the Iraqis who ran the water systems. They could have hired the Iraqis to run the water systems, but they didn't. They walked around, they checked out the scene. In that time, there was no electricity. There was no water being provided. And that built up, of course, bad will. And then by the time Bechtel got to work, it became very unsafe for Bechtel to be at work. The failure of the reconstruction continues, but one of the things that's important for us to remain aware of today is that many of the companies that have radically failed, so Bechtel, a recent report found that they completed less than half of the projects that they were contracted to fulfill, and that was water, electricity, schools, basic rebuilding. Parsons, another analysis just done, that Parsons had barely fulfilled any of its commitments. Of the statistic that Luis gave, Parsons was hired to rebuild 150 primary health centers across the country. They built 34, and not all of them are even functional. but not all of that money has been paid out, and that's an area where we can take action. I just don't nearly have time to say the things that I had planned to say, so let me just say a couple things. The first is the intention of the war to be about oil. Right now, we are in a situation where 5 oil companies, Exxon, Chevron, BP, Shell, and Total, have just signed, within the last week, contracts to get oil to go into Iraq. Anyone with any sense of Iraqi history recognizes the names of these companies. These are the exact same companies that, from the end of World War II until 1970, owned all of Iraq's oil. They were given it as a war bounty at the end of World War I. They owned it, they controlled it, and they controlled Iraq's fate because of owning the oil. Since they were kicked out in the early 1970s, they've been trying to get back in. This is the second or third and maybe the largest pot of oil in the world, depending on who's counting. The world is running out of oil. However, oil sells for $110 a barrel. This oil is sitting there like a gleaming prize at the end of the finishing line. And believe me, they have been planning and plotting to get it. These 5 contracts are the tip of the iceberg. The intent is to get the Iraqis to pass a law that would put everything back the way it was in the 20s, to take it from a nationalized oil system to a privatized oil system, where U.S. oil companies, and a little bit for the French and a little bit for the British, because, you know, we like them, would own and control the oil. Now, if that happens, a U.S. government report that was leaked by ABC News said that, and just so we are using the terminology, this is one of the president's benchmarks for Iraq, which the Congress adopted, passage of an oil law in Iraq. Another one of the benchmarks, by the way, was reversing the debathification law that Bremer put into place that fired all of those experts. The oil law, if it is to be put in place, and if U.S. companies, and the companies that are angling are Exxon, Chevron, Conoco, Marathon, BP, Shell, and Total, if they stay, they will need to be, quote, underwritten by the U.S. government. I take underwritten not by the U.S. government to mean you, to be underwritten by the U.S. military, that we will have to stay to ensure their safety and the continuation of their mission, which was the whole reason why we went there in the first place. Now, I'm supposed to wrap up. Let me say 2 things on hopefulness, because there was a lot of talk last night about where is the U.S. peace movement. In the last several months, and this is a reflection of the last several months and of the last several years, press coverage of Iraq has fallen precipitously, such that where it was 15% of coverage last year, it was 1% of mainstream media coverage in the last period of time that was measured. 1%. The average American at this point thinks that only 3,000 U.S. soldiers have died in Iraq. They don't know what's happening in Iraq. But we also don't know, unless we are listening and watching Democracy Now!, listening and watching KPFA, listening and watching Truth Out, that the peace movement is in fact alive and well and active. You just can't pick up your newspaper to see it. So, for example, to address the problems that we're talking about right now, the corporate pillaging, this Saturday in San Francisco and in Richmond, California, activists are going to be shutting down Chevron's refinery, where it's bringing in Iraqi oil, and they're going to shut it down for a day so that Chevron can't profit off of its Iraqi oil for one day. And they're going to surround the refinery by water, by land, by bike. We've shut down Chevron's headquarters. We've shut down Bechtel's headquarters such that Bechtel got so sick of being shut down every week in San Francisco that after 100 years of being based in San Francisco, they left town. And they have not re-upped after their deep commitment. They wanted to privatize Iraq's water. They wanted to privatize Iraq's electricity. They wanted to stay there. They have not re-upped their contracts. They have not stayed because it was not in their interest to do so. The answer to all of this is, one, that there is activism and there needs to be more. Two, not that the U.S. soldiers have to stay in Iraq to make sure that reconstruction happens. That's not what I'm saying. That Iraqis are more than capable of doing this work and having this money turned over, and that the most important thing is for the occupation to end, and all of the occupation to end, all of the contractors to leave, all of the companies to leave, all of the soldiers to leave, so that Iraqis can pick up the pieces for themselves. Thank you all very, very much.